Hello and welcome back to a new episode of the Podforce One podcast. I'm Miranda Devine. This is the latest installment in our weekly series featuring the most powerful people in the world. Today, we're coming to you from Blair House, also known as the President's Guest House in Washington, D.C. Our guest today is an author, a former TV personality, and an academic. Now she has the best job in DC, Ambassador and Chief of Protocol, Monica Crowley. Ambassador, thank you so much for having us here, and particularly in this absolutely beautiful building, Blair House, that's your new office. Tell us about where we're sitting.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Miranda, and congratulations on this brilliant new show. Well deserved. So it's an absolute pleasure and joy to welcome you to Washington and to welcome you to the Blair House, which is an historic complex of buildings. So it is a delight to come to work here every day. It was built in 1824. And it is the President's Guest House. So every head of state who visits and gets an invitation from the president stays in this magnificent building with incredible history, including Abraham Lincoln, who used one of the rooms as a regular study. Yeah. And General Robert E. Lee was actually offered the commission of the Union Army in one of these rooms and declined because he was from the South and ended up obviously becoming the general of Confederate forces. But every room has this extraordinary history, including Harry Truman, who actually ran his presidency from here for 4 years while the White House was being renovated.
Oh, how interesting. It really is exquisite. All the rooms, the wallpaper, the furniture. It's just must be such a pleasure for you to come to work every day.
It's an absolute blessing and a joy.
And of course, congratulations on your amazing job. I think it's probably the best job in Washington, the best job in the administration, effectively as Ambassador for Protocol for the United States, Assistant Secretary of State. You organize all the parties.
Well, that's a bit of a misnomer.
Right.
But let's go back, because when the president nominated me for this position, of course, it was an honor and a blessing to accept. And everybody came to me, Miranda, and said, Chief of Protocol is the best job in all of Washington, D.C. And now I know why they said that and why they meant it, because it really is. So yes, of course, there is a social component to this position, but it's so much more than that. So the Chief of Protocol and the Office of Chief of Protocol, including my incredible team of both career civil servants and political appointees on the protocol team, they all do an extraordinary job in helping to manage the president's, the vice president's, and the Secretary of State's diplomatic engagements. So what we do is create the optimal environment for the most robust, effective diplomacy for the president, vice president, and the secretary.
That's a massive job.
It is a massive job, but it is extraordinary to see leaders come in. And in fact, I just recently was sworn in, confirmed by the Senate and sworn in. So my first leader meeting, Miranda, was the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz,
and he was with Donald Trump in the Oval Office.
In the Oval Office,
and he mentioned Blair House. I've never heard any leader mention it. He said, "Thank you so much for your wonderful hospitality." And the president was very impressed and very happy that he said that. And I wonder if that's because of your hospitality.
Well, thank you for that, Miranda, but I can't take full credit for those. There is a whole incredible team, both here at Blair House and in the Office of the Chief of Protocol, that makes these visits absolute magic and makes them run incredibly smoothly so that the principals, the president, the vice president, the secretary can engage in the most effective diplomacy for America.
So, for instance, when the German Chancellor came, were you here to greet him and show him to his room? How did that work?
But most of the time, yes, when a world leader comes to the United States, I will go to Joint Base Andrews and greet them and bring them to Washington, to Blair House for their accommodations. And they are always so blown away by Blair House. I mean, they just realize the specialness of this place, and they're so grateful to be able to stay here. So this is the president's guest house. They'll stay. And then on the day of their meeting with the president of the United States, they simply proceed across the way, Pennsylvania Avenue, to the White House. And they're greeted by the president outside the West Wing lobby. And then I escort them in. The world leader will sign the guest book. The president escorts them into the Oval Office, and I make sure that the foreign delegation is also escorted into the Oval Office. We bring in the press. They ask their questions, and President Trump will stay for an hour and a half, taking all questions from the American press and also the foreign press. Yeah. And then they go and they have their working lunch in the cabinet room and tackle whatever issues are in front of them. And then, of course, I escort the world leader out to their motorcade, and then they are back at Blair House and then off on their way, and I bid them farewell.
Fantastic. And now you have coming up in the next couple of years some pretty enormous events that you are going to manage. I guess chief would be the 250th anniversary. Tell us about that and the other events.
Yes, I'm very excited about all of this. So when President Trump announced my nomination as Chief of Protocol of the United States, certainly Chief of Protocol of the White House, and essentially, Miranda, America's Ambassador, which is a label that I wear with great pride and happiness and joy, he also gave me another enormous portfolio, which is to be his administration's representative for major U.S. hosted events. And you named the big three. I'm sure there will be others, but America 250. So next year, we are going to celebrate America's 250th birthday, the anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And then we have the FIFA World Cup next year as well, and the 2028 Los Angeles Olympic Games, which the president heroically brought to the United States. And as he probably tells you, and as he tells the public, he got these events to come to the U.S. in his first term.
Yes.
And he figured, well, after 2020's reelection, he wasn't going to be in office to see those events. And now he says, you know what? 2020 had to happen that way. It was providential.
It was
because
meant to be.
Now he's back.
Yes.
And he will preside over these incredible events. So America 250 is the one that is upon us now. We're going to have a year-long celebration of America, including just had the Army 250 parade. July 4th this year is going to be a magnificent celebration on the National Mall to really kick off 12 months of celebration. And then next year, of course, is going to be just a monumental celebration of America culminating on July 4th.
How good. And so can you tell us any of the sort of events that you're going to be staging to celebrate?
Well, I don't want to get in front of the president on some of the big announcements, but we are thinking and planning of some major events. And of course, the East Coast is the central location of the American Revolution. So cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. will be critical, but all 50 states in the union have their own 250 commissions. So when the audience can go to america250.org, and all 50 states are listed there, so you can click on your state and find out the celebrations and events that are happening in your neck of the woods. You'd celebrate in whatever state you happen to reside. So nationally next year, it is going to be a massive celebration. What I can tell you is in the bicentennial in 1976, one of the fantastic events took place in New York, which has, I believe, the deepest or one of the deepest harbors in America. And there was a tall ships parade that went up the Hudson of tall ships from the United States, but also tall ships representing so many countries around the world. And for next year, yes, I can announce here, for next year, we're also doing the tall ships. It's called Sail Forth. Get it? Sail Fantastic. And we have about 40 plus countries already committed to sending a tall ship for that parade. Yeah. And of course, New York does the Macy's fireworks. So that's just one piece of it. And then in Philadelphia, which obviously is going to be central to America 250, we have planned a mock debate in Independence Hall.
Oh, wow.
So from current members of Congress, probably going to take part in that. A lot of these things are still in the planning stages, but I can guarantee you a massive birthday party for America. And you know what, Miranda, what a gift it is to have President Trump in office during this important milestone for America.
Yes, it really is providential. And I mean, he's such a showman. And with you at his side, I can just imagine that it will be parties everywhere. People will be feeling good. It's a lot about the psychology of the country that allows it to grow. And, you know, I remember the Olympics in Australia, the mood was so positive before and after that the economy got, you know, a little bit of a jump start.
Yes. Oh, that's for sure. I mean, the economic consequences of throwing this party is, and also next year, the World Cup as well. Yeah. That the economic benefits to the American economy, the American people, businesses of all sizes is going to be extraordinary.
But what about the Olympics in Los Angeles? You know, we're seeing that the riots and the problems that they have, you know, with the Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass. How are you concerned that there might be a problem with having it be ready and safe?
Well, there's California leadership, there's Los Angeles leadership, and then there is the International Olympic Committee as well as the U.S. Olympic Committee. They're all involved in trying to get Los Angeles ready for these Olympic Games in 2028. And don't just, you know, it's not just about the riots, Miranda. Don't forget about the fires that devastated so much of Los Angeles at the end of last year. So there's a lot of work to be done. We're getting through America's birthday, we're getting through the FIFA World Cup, but the Olympic Games are coming down the pike very fast. So the planners are on top of it, as far as I know, and we will stay on top of it too with regard to the administration to make sure that the Olympic Games, just like America's birthday and the World Cup, showcase America at its best, not just American leadership and dynamism, but also the United States as a real centerpiece for international events in the safest, most secure place in the world to host these kinds of things.
And LA is beautiful and does have amazing weather. So it should be the perfect place for it.
Absolutely.
Now, your relationship with Donald Trump goes way back, and tell us about how you first came to meet him and about the connection that you both have with President Nixon.
Oh, well, thank you for asking. I feel very blessed to have worked for two American presidents, President Nixon, during the last 4 years of his life, not born when he was elected president. A lot of people said, look at me, and they squint and they're like, you look good. I'm like, no, you misunderstand. I was not born when he was elected, but I did end up working with him during the last 4 years of his life, which was an extraordinary opportunity because I traveled around the world with President Nixon. And I was so young. I was fresh out of college, 21, 22 years old.
How did that happen?
Thank you for asking, because I love to share this story. It's such a Cinderella story. I was majoring in political science at Colgate University, and I was majoring in poli-sci, so it was like the presidency and the Congress, all very interesting to me. But in the spring of my junior year, I took a course called National Security, and it absolutely blew me away, to the point where I got an A+ in the class, the only A+. I just fell in love with the material. And I went to the professor to ask for advice about how to turn it into a career. And it turned out he was one of two conservative professors on campus, and I was pretty much the only conservative kid on the campus. So he became a mentor to me. And at the end of this course, I was getting ready to go home to New Jersey before my senior year. And I asked him for some advice. I said, I love national security, American foreign policy. How do I turn this into a career? And Miranda, he got up and he walked over to his bookcase and he took 4 books down and he handed them to me. And he said, go home this summer and read these books. And when you come back in the fall, we'll talk about what you learned from them and then how to parlay your passion into a career. So 2 of the volumes were Kissinger's memoirs, which are over 1,000 pages. And I was so tired after the school year, I said, I'll get to those in August. So the first book I chose to read was the slimmest one, and it was called 1999, Victory Without War, written by former President Richard Nixon. And when I say this book blew me away, Miranda, it blew me. I read it like it was a novel, almost in one sitting. And
What's
I decided about foreign policy. So President Nixon, after he resigned, he wrote his memoirs. And then starting in 1980, every 2 years, he'd write a new foreign policy book to reflect the changing world. So this happened to be his latest foreign policy book at the time. So I read it, and he had so educated me with this book and illuminated so many things for me that I sat down and I wrote him a letter. This is kind of like the naivety of youth, right?
Yes.
Here I am, like 21, writing the former president and a very controversial president, but I've just felt compelled to let that author know that he had really educated and inspired me.
Yeah.
So I wrote him a letter, and it dealt with the issues he raised in the book. And at the very end, Miranda, I had a single line where I said, well, Mr. President, I know how incredibly busy you are, but if you have a moment, I'd love to come visit with you, shake your hand, and pay my respects to you.
Wow.
Miranda, I never expected a response, ever. But about a month later, I was getting ready to go back to Colgate for my senior year. And I went to my mother's mailbox, and I took out a handwritten response from Richard Nixon to me.
How old was he then?
He was 76, going on 77. Yeah. He died at 81.
Right.
So he was about 75, 76. And at first I thought it was my friends playing a prank on me. I didn't realize that it was authentic. And when I realized it, I began to shake because there was something in me that said, this letter is going to change the trajectory of your entire life. So at the beginning of my senior year, I set up an appointment. I went to go see him. It was extraordinary. I was a college kid with no money, no connections, no nothing.
Where was he living?
In northern New Jersey, right outside New York City. Right. Yeah. He gave me an hour and a half of his time. And again, extraordinary for a former president to give a college kid that much time. But we sat and we spoke, and he walked me around the world and told me what American policy was in every corner of the globe and what it should be. And then we talked a little bit about domestic policy and then a little bit about domestic politics and political gossip.
Wow.
It was just extraordinary. This was 1989. I was going into my senior year. So we kept up a correspondence until I graduated the following May from Colgate, and that's when he offered me a job. So I ended up working with him as a foreign policy assistant for the last 4 years of his life.
And did you ever ask him what made you decide to reply to this college kid?
You know, that is a really incisive question, Miranda. This is why you're so good at what you do. He had a very small staff. He had a chief of staff. He had another assistant, and then he had like a secretary. And remember when he was in Congress and then in the White House, he had Rosemary Woods as his secretary. Well, in his later years, he had a secretary named Carmen, and she was a Puerto Rican girl from the Bronx who had only graduated high school. She was so fiercely loyal to him. He would say to me, Carmen is the best I've ever had, apart from Rose Woods. She was so tough and loyal to him with street smarts. I mailed 2 copies of my letter to President Nixon, one to his publisher, care of his publisher, and one to care of his local post office in New Jersey.
Oh, wow.
Never expected either one would see the light of day. Do you know, Carmen got all of his mail every day, and he used to get barrels of mail every day. She saw both copies of my letter, and it was Carmen who said he needs to see this.
Because she knew he would like it.
Yes, because it was coming from a young person who had admired him. And after everything he had been through.
He really was terribly badly treated. I mean, you look back in hindsight now and you think, you know, these days no one would resign. No president would resign. They'd stick it out and maybe survive.
Yes, like Bill Clinton after Monica Lewinsky, President Trump after everything he went through in his they learned the lesson from President Nixon. And it meant so much to him to see a younger person, the future of America, admire him and respect him enough to write that kind of letter. So he wrote me a letter. And like I said, we met at the beginning of my my senior year at Colgate. And then we kept up a correspondence until I graduated the following May of 1990. And that's when he offered me a job.
And what was the job? You said you were traveling with him all over the world?
So my title was Foreign Policy Assistant, but I really did so much more because he kept a very, very small staff.
Right.
So I traveled around the world with him and met with all of the heads of state at the time with whom he met. Yeah. So Yitzhak Rabin, who then was assassinated shortly after his meeting with President Nixon, Francois Mitterrand in France, Lech Walesa in Poland, Václav Havel in Prague, Boris Yeltsin in Russia. And I was with President Nixon on his last trip to China, which was extraordinary, Miranda, given that 20 years before he had opened the door to China and changed the entire global calculus, but certainly Sino-US relations.
And how did they treat him in China?
Like a rock star.
Right, really.
Rock star, Miranda. He used to do something very, very clever. They worshipped him in China because he had opened China to the rest of the world. Now, President Nixon was nothing if not adaptable to the changing world. So I think he would understand now that China is a complete adversary and an existential threat to the United States. But then the calculus was that the Soviet Union was growing in power in real terms, in terms of their nuclear arsenal, their conventional weapons arsenal, and that the United States, being so constrained at the time by the duties and responsibilities and drag of the Vietnam War, that President Nixon's latitude, his ability to maneuver foreign policy was really restricted by Vietnam. It's what my PhD dissertation is all about. Really? Yeah. So I know this inside and out. But in order to buy time strategically for the United States, he decided to open the door to China, to use China as a strategic counterweight against growing Soviet power. And now President Trump is doing almost or wants to, I think, do a reverse Nixon and try to improve relations with Moscow to use Russia as a counterweight against growing Chinese power. But that's something that's coming.
It makes a lot of sense.
It makes so much sense
because the worst thing is to have what happened recently under Biden is to have Russia and China and Iran into each other's
aligned. Yes, and presidents of both parties for decades have exerted themselves to keep both countries apart. And then Biden, of course, drove them together, which is madness. But I traveled all around the world with him. And in China, because he was considered such a rock star, a couple of things. He and Henry Kissinger were really the only two who could talk turkey to the Chinese communist leadership, tell them the truth, and have them sit there and take it with no pushback.
And was he personally wounded? Did you see, about the way he was driven out of office, the kind of dirty tricks against him, and also just the complete traducing of his reputation ever since?
Well, almost right after he resigned, he had a very serious attack of phlebitis, which is blood clots in the legs, which almost killed him. He was hospitalized. Stress-related, yes, of course. And by the time I got to him, it was 20 years or so later. And I could see it in his physical frame where his shoulders were hunched over. And, he wore his presidency with pride and he wore America with pride, but you could see that he carried it. I mean, we've had many presidents with no conscience whatsoever, Miranda. He did. He had one. And he spoke about it publicly before I got to him. But he did say to me, I bear huge responsibility. The buck stopped with me in all of this. And he carried it. So he spent the next 20 years of his life to his death trying to make it up to the American people for letting them down. He, at the very end, only started to get an inkling that it was the deep state who got him. Oh. So in 1992, there was a book written by two Democrat investigative journalists called Silent Coup. And they started to unearth the deep state plot to remove Richard Nixon. And it was only at the tail end of his life where he started to see some of the documents and evidence about how he was set up. But he wouldn't.
Do you believe he was?
He wouldn't evade responsibility for his set of decisions. Yeah. But what I will say, given all these years later and knowing what we know about this, it does look like because Nixon was a peacemaker, because he wasn't willing to necessarily play ball, that there were some dark
victory without
dark
war
corners.
Is like peace through strength.
Correct.
Right.
That there were some enemies that he created along the way that didn't necessarily want to see him succeed.
No, and were opportunistic and found some error that he'd made and used it against him. Now, what is the connection with Donald Trump? We know that, I'll tell you one quick little story. In the White House, there is a portrait of Nixon, and I don't think President Trump will mind my repeating this story, but he passes that every morning on his way to the Oval Office, and he has a little, I don't know if you call it shudder or a feeling of his mortality, because it reminds him of what he needs to do to constantly keep friendly with the Congress, because Nixon didn't do that. And so at his hour of need, he had no one there to protect him. They all turned their back on him. So President Trump, unusually, he is constantly on the phone and duchessing. Every member of Congress has an open door. They can come and do selfies, whatever, and late at night. And so I think that Nixon's mistake in that sense, and he was a man of his time, has galvanized President Trump to be much more self-protective. Is that so? Tell me just about the relationship between President Trump and President Nixon.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That means a lot to me, because I'm so blessed to work with both presidents at different points in their career and their lives. And I always joke, man, do I know how to pick them or what?
Yes.
Only the most controversial presidents for me.
Yeah.
But President Nixon really was America First before America First was kind of a galvanizing thing. Remember, he had Pat Buchanan, who was also America First later, like in 1992 when he ran for president. He was a speechwriter for President Nixon.
Right.
So there's so many cyclical things that move through history here. They're similar in a lot of ways. And I will tell you that in the late 1980s, before my time with President Nixon, Mrs. Nixon saw Donald Trump on the Phil Donahue show. Mm-hmm. And she said to President Nixon, he is incredibly impressive.
Wow.
And said, he could have a political future if he wanted one. And at the time, of course, Donald Trump was massive in New York, real estate guru and building New York skyline and a billionaire. President Nixon wrote him a note and said, Mrs. Nixon saw you on the Donahue show, and I agree with her that you were incredibly impressive. And if you want a political future, you will succeed and you will win.
Amazing. And so President Trump really took that to heart.
He took it to heart, yes. Yeah. And he shows the letter proudly. What means a lot to me, and what I think would mean so much to President Nixon, is that the history, Miranda, is coming full circle as we know more about how certain forces in this town operate, right? And the full vindication, I think, of President Nixon is coming to pass. And in fact, during my swearing in the Oval Office, I invited President Nixon's grandson, Christopher Nixon Cox, who's a friend who I've known since he was 11 years old, to join me because I wanted President Nixon represented in the Oval Office.
That's wonderful.
And President Trump greeted him, and he said, your grandfather was a great man. So my goal is to get that portrait that you just talked about of President Nixon into the Oval Office eventually.
Oh, fantastic.
Which would be full restoration of the great man of President Nixon. They're both similar. I mean, they're obviously different men, but they both have and had a seriousness of purpose of putting America first, seeing the world in a strategic way, seeing how all of the pieces of the puzzle work together. And both were visionaries, Miranda. And by that, I mean, and we've only had a few visionaries as president over the course of America's history, but by visionary, I mean that they have a unique ability to see what the world and the country is going to look like 20, 30, 40 years down the road, and then make American policy in the moment to anticipate that world. That was Richard Nixon. That is Donald Trump. And so there is a natural policy affinity, but also an America First affinity, but also a natural personal one, I think, as well.
And also forging their own path, which inevitably put them in a collision course with the deep state, whatever we call the blob. And both were attacked, and President Trump has managed to, I guess, learn the lessons and rise above it and triumph in the most incredible way. Your first knowledge of President Trump, I think he spotted you just like Nixon or Pat Nixon spotted him. Tell us about that.
So I knew President Trump as Donald Trump a little bit, just in social circles in New York, going to some of the same events. And President Trump, we have some mutual friends in New York and so on. So it wasn't like a deep friendship, but I knew him and he knew of me. And then, of course, as you know, he's an avid consumer of television news. So I began on Fox News literally day one in October of 1996. I was on the air when Fox News was literally just like a pull-out chair and one camera operator, and that was it. So he had been watching me over the years on television. And I'll never forget when he came down that escalator in June of 2015, 10 years now, exactly 10 years. When he came down that escalator and I heard him give that first speech. And of course, there was so much controversy that the press created around it. First, they disregarded him. They said, he's never going to last. This is a vanity run, or this is just for The Apprentice. This is for his brand. And when I heard him speak the truth in layman's terms, not as a politician.
About the border?
About the border. Yeah. And he said they're not sending their best. Remember, he said they're sending murderers and rapists.
And he was
and
right.
I was watching it, and I watched the fake outrage around it that day. There was something in me that said, he's the one. He is the one that is not just going to save the GOP, but he's the one that's going to save the country and, frankly, the West. It was almost like an internal.
You're one of the few, really.
Really.
Originals.
And I was one of the, if not the first, like non-family supporter of President Trump, because I just knew it was a visceral reaction to what he said and how he said it and how he positioned himself. And, I said this to him in the Oval Office when I was sworn in. He did the most astonishingly powerful thing I have ever heard from any leader ever. He looked at the forgotten men and women of America and he said, I see you, I hear you, and I will be your champion. And I get emotional even now thinking about that because for decades, he had talked about the forgotten men and women who were getting screwed over by the uni party on both sides, screwing them over for, trade, globalization, you name it. And the people who actually make this country work were getting nothing. They were getting sold down the river and nobody cared. And he kept talking about that for decades, hoping that somebody would rise up and say, yes, Donald Trump is right. I'm going to take this on. And nobody did. So in 2015, he said, you know what? I'll do it. He didn't need it. He didn't want it. But he felt a responsibility to them and to America to take that on. And that was I've always said that his appeal is not ideological. He's not like a traditional conservative or Republican. His appeal is attitudinal.
Yes. Common sense.
Attitudinal, right. Bring America back. Make America great
Optimistic,
again.
energetic.
Yes.
The epitome of the American dream.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because he's lived it.
Yeah.
So, and he knew that people who were struggling in middle America, the Rust Belt, the industrial belt that got sold down the river, they didn't have the American dream anymore. And he said, you know what, since nobody else is going to do it, I will restore that dream for them. That, Miranda, is the most powerful thing because it's not a political appeal, it's an emotional one. And I said, when I heard him say that, I said, nobody's going to lay a glove on him. He is going to make it all the way. And then it was on Fox News, I think, with Bill O'Reilly and then Don Imus. And they were all laughing like, oh, this is going to end in 3 weeks. And I remember saying something to the effect of, stop laughing. Do not underestimate him. He is going to pull the whole thing off. And I was born out.
Right. And did he see it?
He saw it. And to this day, he remembers that.
Yes.
And he'll say to me once in a while, like, you're one of very, very few who has been with me since day one.
It means a lot to him.
Thin.
Loyalty means everything to him. I've never known someone who puts so much stock in loyalty. He'll talk to you if you weren't loyal, but he remembers who was really loyal.
Yes.
And so then he invited you to come and work for him.
Yes.
And that was a pinnacle, but it was also the beginning. You were probably one of the first victims of or targets of the left's cancellation culture. And they obviously saw you as a real threat.
And in many ways, those of us who have been loyal to him from the beginning, his enemies see us as extensions of him.
And not one of them has escaped without scar tissue.
Well, I wear it as a badge of honor.
Yes.
Because in many ways I was like patient zero.
Yes.
Because
he's
for
got
what
the
happened
literal
to me.
Scar tissue in his ear now.
Absolutely. No, he's taken literal bullets for us and the forgotten men and women and for America. But I wear it as a badge of honor. In the first term, originally I was going in with General Flynn to be the strategic communications director for the National Security Council, given my background in national security. And what we didn't realize at the time was the deep state was targeting General Flynn and wanted to remove him to get to President Trump. And so they attacked me first so that they could isolate General Flynn and leave him without anybody who could defend him. So they came at me first.
You really were patient zero.
Yeah, really was. January of 2017, before President Trump was even inaugurated the first time. But I wear it as a badge of honor. I've restored my reputation after all of those smears. And then I was invited to join the Treasury Department in May of 2019. So I ended up serving in the first Trump administration as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Fantastic experience.
And you were also vindicated, though, because I think they came after your PhD thesis at Columbia.
Yes.
And Columbia did an investigation and found there was no
research misconduct whatsoever.
Yeah.
And the original report from CNN, what the reporters didn't say was that when they put up their report, that I had allegedly done 48 examples of what they call plagiarism, that they had omitted dozens of my footnotes deliberately to make it look like I didn't cite my work. So it was a deliberate smear that had nothing to do with me, but I did CNN, have to fight back.
Of course.
Yes, of course. So it was all weaponized against me. But what I came to realize, Miranda, that those smears were not about me.
Yes.
It was about getting Flynn and then ultimately hurting President Trump.
It must have been devastating for you, though, at that time.
Oh, at the time,
you were a high flyer. That was the dream job.
Exactly right. Yeah. And so to have that happen out of nowhere, because the attacks were coming at President Trump, but really not his team, except for Paul Manafort. Yeah. There were some indications, but never in my life did I think I would be in the crosshairs of the deep state, but it came right at me.
How did you cope with that?
My faith.
Right.
My faith, yes. And of course, I have a lot of great support from my family and friends. And then I restored my reputation because I fought back and proceeded to restore, what I had lost. But my faith in God really got me through prayer. And that source of strength was tremendous during that time. And I will say what I believe, God doesn't restore you to where you were. He restores you greater.
And stronger.
And stronger.
And wiser.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so then you worked with President Trump through his term.
Yes. In the first term, I was there for 2 years. And what was extraordinary about that time, Miranda, is when I came in, the Trump economy was booming
yes.
because of the Trump tax cuts, because of regulatory relief, because of unleashing our great energy sector, and because he was negotiating fairer trade deals, right?
He was set for a blistering win in 2020.
Exactly. So when I came in May of 2019, I said to my predecessor who was leaving Treasury, I said, oh, this is fantastic. And then I joked and I said, just don't stick me with a crappy economy. Ha ha. And then COVID hit.
Right.
So I was in office, with the president presiding over an unprecedented shutdown of the U.S. and global economies, which had never been seen before. We were flying without a net. The president, the secretary, nobody could call their predecessor and say, what did you do in the last pandemic? In the last global economic shutdown, there was nobody to go for advice on how to handle any of this. So everything that President Trump did, Secretary Mnuchin did, our teams did, was completely unprecedented. Nobody had ever seen anything like that before. President Trump does not get enough credit for saving the U.S. economy, and businesses of all sizes, from small businesses with the PPP program to industries like the airline industry. We had bridge programs to get them through the most acute part of that crisis. He doesn't get nearly as much credit as he deserves for getting us through that. And
I mean, I guess the big spending happened with Biden when it was really unnecessary, when the economy was bouncing back anyway.
Yes.
So it was a more limited. It was still too much government spending. And now just let's talk about you and your upbringing and what made you into the resilient, faithful person you are. You were an Army brat.
Yes. So I was born at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, which is a center for Army intelligence, which makes like the Army 250 parade and the celebration of our military so personally special to me. But I was there, but just as a toddler. So I don't really recall being there.
Was your dad a spy?
No, he was not a spy.
Okay.
He was a lieutenant colonel in the Army, late Vietnam era, but they kept him stateside to train officers who were going to Vietnam and so on. Now, maybe he was a spy and just didn't tell me, Miranda. That could well be. But then we moved to the East Coast. He left the military, and I grew up in New Jersey, went to public schools. I have a phenomenal mother, as well as a great role model, and I have a sister who's 2 years younger.
And your mother was a teacher?
Yes, she was a teacher most of her career. And then later in her life, she became a hospital administrator in New Jersey. So she changed careers.
And she was a solo mum for a good part of your childhood.
Yeah, from the time I was about 9 years old. She was a single mother and did a phenomenal job with my sister and me. And she used to say, I have to be both mother and father. So she would sit us down like at age 12 and say, if you do drugs, I'll kill you. If you smoke, I'll kill you. If you drink before you're 21, I'll kill you.
Sounds like President Trump. That's exactly what he said.
Yeah.
He said this. I said, what's the secret of parenting? Because he gets, his kids are all great.
Yeah.
And he said exactly that.
Yeah. She's like, do not get pregnant before you're married or I'll find the guy and kill him first and then I'll kill you. And my sister and I knew that she meant it. She was a tough disciplinarian, but she did it with love. And that's the way, to keep your children on course.
And your faith, tell me a little bit, what religion are you?
Yeah, so I was raised Catholic, and I am a pretty devout Christian. And my faith in God and Jesus as my personal savior has got me through a lot of tough times in my life. And it just brings me a sense of inner peace. There's scripture that says, peace that surpasses all understanding. I've internalized that now. And one of my favorite scriptures comes from Isaiah, where it says, my way is not your way. My ways are not your ways. My ways are higher than your ways. And I often think when I'm caught up in the secular world, as we all are, and the day-to-day worries and the day-to-day responsibilities, I'll refer back to that. My ways are not your ways. So when things happen that don't seem to make sense or that are uncomfortable or painful, it's horrible at the time. And everybody experiences these things. But I try to go back to that particular piece of scripture, and it does bring me that peace that surpasses all understanding. Like, God knows what he's doing.
Yes, God moves in mysterious ways.
He knows what he's doing, yes.
Yeah.
And when things happen in your life that don't seem to make sense or are incredibly painful and hurtful and not fair, we've all had that. Later in life, when you go back and look at the arc of your life, it does, from that perspective, it all starts to make sense.
Mm.
And even now I look back, and I was with President Nixon for 4 years until he passed away. And he brought me into every meeting he had with every head of state, whether it was Yitzhak Rabin or Boris Yeltsin or Francois Mitterrand or Lech Walesa or the Chinese communist leadership. And now here I am,
yes,
where the president has made me his representative to the rest of the world, dealing directly with the heads of state with whom he is dealing. I'm telling you, it's a full circle moment, yes, Miranda, and
it's
it means so much
really.
to me. Yes.
Yeah. He would be, imagine looking down. He probably was in this house himself, President Nixon.
Many times, yes.
Yeah, so he must be very proud of his protege. And how amazing the link with President Trump. I mean, maybe it was President Nixon's inspiration to Donald Trump that made him start thinking about a political career for himself.
Maybe.
Yeah.
A full circle moment for President Trump, for me too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ambassador Crowley. It's just
my pleasure.
Very, very wonderful to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Miranda.
Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us today on Podforce One. Please hit the like and subscribe buttons so you can join us next week for another major interview from Washington.